Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to knit spirals, which are also called curlicues. There are many ways to make these, and today I'm going to show you my two favourite methods. You can then alter these patterns to suit you, for instance making the spirals longer or shorter, tighter or more loose. Note that for these demonstrations I'm going to be using chunky yarn and a needle that's smaller than what's recommended. On my yarn label it recommends 6mm needles and I'm going to be using 5.5mm needles. Using a needle that's a bit smaller than what's recommended should make your spirals tighter and a bit neater. Right, so for the first example I'm going to cast on 20 stitches. Note that the more stitches you cast on, the longer your spiral will be. I'm using the long tail cast on to do this, but you could use your favourite method. Just make sure that you cast on quite loosely. You then need to do a KFBF increase on every stitch. In other words, we're going to be doing a double increase on each stitch, which will triple the number of stitches. KFBF stands for knit into the front, then the back, and then the front again. And to do this, you first knit into the stitch as normal, but you don't push the stitch off the needle. Instead, you pull on the right hand needle slightly to loosen the stitch, take the right hand needle to the back, then go down through the back of the same stitch. Do all of the normal steps of a knit stitch again, except once again you don't push the stitch off the needle. Instead, you knit into the front of the same stitch again, and this time it's basically just a normal knit stitch. And that's one KFBF increase completed. There should now be 3 stitches on the right hand needle. And again, so knit into the front of the stitch, but don't push the stitch off the needle. Loosen the stitch a bit, take the right hand needle to the back and go down through the back of the stitch. Do the usual steps of a knit stitch, except you don't slip the stitch off the needle. Then knit into the front of the same stitch again. And this time you complete the stitch. And again, so knit into the front of the stitch, the back of the stitch, and the front of the stitch again. And just keep repeating this all across the row. Then you need to bind off all of these stitches. You can really use any method for this, but I'm going to bind off purlwise. So I purl 2, and then I bind off 1 stitch. So I pick up the lower stitch down on the right hand needle, take it over the stitch above, and drop it off the end of the needle. And then I repeat purl 1 and bind off 1 over and over until the end of the row. So that's purl 1 and bind off 1, taking the lower stitch over the upper stitch and dropping it off the end of the needle. Purl 1, bind off 1, and so on. Note that you don't want to bind off too tightly. Once you've only got one stitch left, you need to cut the yarn, like so, and then feed the yarn tail through the last stitch and tighten. Finish by weaving in the yarn tails. And that's it, that's one spiral completed. Here you can see another example I did, where instead of doing KFBF increases, I just did KFB increases, which are single increases. I also used a slightly bigger needle size, 6mm, and I also did a purl row after the increase row. In comparison, you can see that this spiral is quite loose, and that's partially due to the larger needle, but mostly due to using KFB increases rather than KFBF increases. Adding a purl row just made the band a bit wider. So in conclusion, the pattern that I've shown you is the basic pattern, but you can alter this as you see fit. So you can cast on more stitches to make the spiral longer. You can use KFB increases rather than KFBF increases if you want a looser spiral. You can use a smaller needle size to make the spiral tighter. And you can even add between 1 and 3 rows after the increase row if you want to make the band wider. If you want to add additional rows, I would recommend using stockinette stitch, garter stitch or seed stitch. Basically, there's quite a few ways of altering this pattern. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly show you one more pattern, and this time we're going to be knitting a spiral from end to end. This is the same method you would use to make an I-cord, except we're going to be introducing slip stitches, which are longer than knit stitches, and that's what creates the spiral effect. The first thing you need to do is cast on 3 stitches. I'm going to be using the same yarn as before, but I'm going to be using 2 5.5mm double pointed needles instead. If you don't have double pointed needles, feel free to use a circular needle. I used a long tail cast on, but you could use your favourite method. For row 1, you need to knit those 3 stitches. Then slide these stitches to the other end of the needle. Then for row 2, you knit 1 and slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back. So make sure the working yarn is behind the needles, then take your right hand needle down through the front of the next stitch as if to purl, but instead of purling it, you just slip it off the end of the needle, like so. Knit the last stitch, and then slide these stitches to the other end of the needle. And then row 3 is the same as row 2. So knit 1, then slip a stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, then knit 1 and slide the stitches to the other end of the needle. And you just repeat these 3 rows until you've got a long enough spiral. I bound off this spiral using the standard knit bind off and wove in the yarn tails. And this is the result. As you can see, it's quite a loose spiral compared to the one I made in the first demonstration. And that's it, that's how you knit spirals or curlicues. I really hope you found that useful, and thank you very much for watching.